Hi, this is Jared from Yellowwood Guiding, and in this video we're going to talk about basic composition and the rule of thirds. When we're on a tour, I always make everyone recite the holy rule of composition, and that is I will never, ever, ever, ever put anything in the middle. It's a great way to take beginners and have them stop putting stuff in the middle, but that is a rule. Rules can be broken, and I want to show you this. This here, the shot of the flower, there's really nothing in the middle except for the very middle part of the flower. But most of the interesting stuff is actually on the outsides. If you make a square composition or you shoot a face and there's actually nothing truly in the middle, you can break the rule. But generally, you want to put things off to the sides. One of the basic rules is the rule of thirds in photography. And here's a great example of the rule of thirds. This little golden mantled ground squirrel is sitting here on a rock, and what you want to do with the rule of thirds, if I bring up the crop tool in Lightroom, I've got a thirds line. And the chipmunk's, or I should say the ground squirrel's eye, is almost exactly on one of the power points. The power points of the rule of thirds is where the lines cross. That's where things are most interesting. So in wildlife and macro photography, it's often good to put interesting things at the thirds. We're going to talk about how the rule of thirds is just a guideline to take you on to that next level of composition. So here's a shot. Golden mantled ground squirrel standing alert. His eye is perfectly in the line of thirds, but if you look, there's not a whole lot of room over here on his side. It's not a great composition. So if we move the ground squirrel over, we're taking this to the next shot. Here we moved the ground squirrel over. He's got a lot of room on this side still to live, but he's looking in this direction. With wildlife, if they're looking in the direction, you give them more side that way. That adds emotion. We're going to talk about that more in the animal composition video. But here the rule of thirds, not perfectly in the line, but here ground squirrel is almost perfectly in the middle, and it really loses a bit of emotion. It's very subtle, but those little elements can go from a 9 to a 10 image when you're looking at quality. So here's a shot. Is this rule of thirds? Actually it is. Because the petals are coming out across, I couldn't crop it, put it on one side, but the flower itself is 1/3 of the way from the top. Great way to look at it when you're lost. Macro, it works great. Here with this pika running across the snow, when you've got a lot of landscape, a lot of area around the animal, using the rule of thirds can be sometimes very good. Look at our pikas right in our third line running down towards. Great way to look at how to compose. Again, another rule of thirds composition with this elk. The elk was looking straight down the line. I mean, maybe we could crop this image and bring it over here so it's more of a square crop. That could also work, but it's actually just as interesting getting all these sedges and everything in the background and putting the animal at a third line. Remember, the third is a guideline of where to start. This is an example of taking that rule of thirds to that next level. There's actually nothing in the middle except the deer's forehead. The eyes are close to the thirds, the base of the ears are close to the third, the nose is down in the sixth, but the animal's looking at us. When the animal looks straight down the lens, that's a great time to actually zoom in and put things, put the middle of the head, the middle of the nose potentially, in the center. But the other elements of the head, of the body, are at the third lines. Using macro, again, with a lot of blurry background, is a great way to put the rule of thirds to use. Check this out. We put our ant right at our third, we cropped it in just a little bit, and we have this interesting aspect of our ant standing out looking off to oblivion on top of our leaf. So landscapes, using the rule of thirds, great way to take a look here. Is this a rule of thirds? Well, this is where things start to get interesting. We're going to start abandoning the rule of thirds for the rule of sixths. If you look, the top of the sky, from the sky to the top of Hallett's Peak here, is about 1/6. It's about halfway between these lines. Now down here in the reflection is about a rule of thirds line. But up here, the sky, what I thought was much more interesting in this shot is the water reflecting down here. And putting that line of the mountains about 1/6 to 1/8 sky is much more interesting. So taking a look, remember that the rule of eighths and the rule of sixths also apply. This is a shot where the rule of thirds goes right out the window. In landscapes, quite often, the rule of sixths come in more interesting. If you look, the horizon out there is about a sixth. Here's a third line, go half of that, it's 1/6. And look at where all our interesting things are in the element of the image. Here on this side, 1/6 of the way is where a lot of these elements line up. Here this rock lines up on a third, but this one and this bigger rock out here lines up about 1/6. And again, the sky at 1/6. That's an important thing to look at. Compose not rule of thirds. If we'd had a bunch of sky, it just sort of fades out up here. But we want to get the detail. So take a look here with this shot. Taking a look at this aspect, we've got not a shot that takes the rule of thirds, but we're probably playing with what I call the rule of eighths. If you're in the Rockies and you have blue sky, the sky should probably be no more than 1/8 or 1/6 of the total image, and pointing your camera down helps a lot. Now, there's exception to that. If you're shooting calendars, if you're shooting magazine covers, they need to put the title somewhere. But if you're shooting fine art, generally taking your camera and taking out the sky is more interesting, and putting things at the third would offer a lot more sky and really not add much. What really makes this shot, which won Image of the Week a few weeks ago, was the fact that we're looking down. Taking a look here, this shot is a rule of thirds based image, but it also applies to the rule of sixths. These rocks are about, the most interesting part of them are about a sixth. This little fall down here is about a sixth. Over here is a sixth. Right there, right here. Most of the things are interesting about halfway between our third lines, and that's in landscape very common to get your best aspects. And here for the finale, when you want to, you can add a lot of sky in the image, but there has to be something really interesting in the sky, and that's a great time to use the rule of thirds. You can see the horizon line roughly is about a third of the way into the image. We got our trees over here on the side. They're about a sixth of the way into the image, again over here and right here. That's what makes composition important. So remember, the rule of thirds is where you start when you're lost, but then you start to change your composition, move things closer to your edges, and you'll start to even get better compositions. So remember the rule of thirds, and then remember to start expanding from the rule of thirds, and you'll really improve your compositions.